I was halfway down the highway when the last radio station faded into static. Outside my car window, the world had shrunk into a narrow stretch of road, swallowed on both sides by endless trees. The sky, a dull shade of gray, loomed heavy above me. According to the GPS, I had just 20 minutes left before I reached Black Hollow, a town so small it barely existed on the map. I adjusted the rearview mirror, catching my own tired eyes. A week ago, I was chasing stories that no one cared about: celebrity gossip, political scandals, the kind of headlines people scrolled past without a second thought. Then, a strange email landed in my inbox. Come to Black Hollow. Every night, someone screams for help. Then they vanish. No one talks about it. No sender. No follow-up. Just that. I should have ignored it. But here I was, gripping the wheel a little tighter as I rolled past a rusted sign at the side of the road. Welcome to Black Hollow. Population, 3,126. A shadow of unease settled over me. Something about that number felt wrong. I pulled into town just as the sun dipped below the horizon. The streets were quiet, unnaturally so. A handful of people moved along the sidewalks, heads down, footsteps quick. A woman glanced at me from the window of a grocery store before pulling the blinds shut. The town looked frozen in time. Brick buildings with peeling paint, a diner with neon lights flickering weakly, and a gas station that seemed abandoned. It was the kind of place where news traveled fast, where strangers were noticed the moment they arrived. I parked outside the only motel in sight, Hollow Pines Inn. The sign buzzed faintly, the bow in hollow struggling to stay lit. I grabbed my bag, locked the car, and stepped inside. The air smelled of dust and old carpet. Behind the desk sat a man in his 60s, his face lined with years of cigarette smoke and lost sleep. He barely looked up as I approached. Room? His voice was dry, as if he hadn't spoken much today. Yeah, I said. One night for now. His fingers hovered over the register. You a cop? I blinked. No. Why? He hesitated, then shook his head. Never mind. That'll be 45. I slid cash across the counter. He handed me a key without another word. As I turned to leave, he muttered, almost to himself, lock your door. Don't open it for no one. I glanced back, but he was already staring at the television in the corner, pretending I wasn't there. Upstairs, my room was small. Single bed, outdated wallpaper, a television that probably hadn't worked in years. The window faced the street. I pulled the curtain back, peering outside. The town was nearly empty now. Shops had closed, street lights buzzed dimly, and in the distance, an old church bell told the hour. 9 o'clock. I settled onto the bed, flipping through my notes. If the rumors were true, someone would scream for help tonight. Someone would vanish. I set my phone to record and placed it on the nightstand. Then I waited. The night stretched on, heavy with silence. Hours passed. Midnight came and went. Then, at exactly 2:13 a.m., I heard it. A voice, raw with terror, cutting through the quiet. Help me! I shot up, heart hammering. Rushing to the window, I scanned the street below. A man was walking down the road, barefoot, in nothing but a white undershirt and pajama pants. His arms flailed wildly as he screamed again. Somebody help me. No one came. No lights flicked on. The town remained still, as if no one else had heard him. I grabbed my phone and bolted for the door. By the time I reached the street, the man was farther down, his pace quickening. Then, without warning, he stopped. His head snapped toward me. Even from a distance, I could see his eyes wide with panic, his mouth forming words I couldn't hear. He lifted a trembling hand, reaching out, and then he was gone. Not taken, not pulled away. He just vanished. The street was empty. No sign of him. No footprints on the pavement. Nothing. I stood frozen, my breath clouding in the cold night air. My phone was still recording, the timer blinking. I hit stop and replayed the last few seconds. The man's scream echoed back at me, clear as day. But then, just as he disappeared, something else came through the speakers. A whisper, low, distorted. A voice I didn't recognize. You're next. The air in Black Hollow carried a strange weight at night. It wasn't the kind of silence you'd find in a peaceful town. It was the kind that pressed against your skin, as if the darkness itself was watching, waiting. I stood on the cracked sidewalk just outside my motel, my hands stuffed into my jacket pockets. The clock on my phone read 2:12 a.m. My breath curled in the cold air. The street was empty, the houses dark. Not a single window glowed with the soft comfort of a bedside lamp. It was as if the entire town had agreed to sleep through whatever was about to happen. And then it began. A distant sound, faint at first, like the wind pushing through narrow alleyways. Then a shuffle of footsteps. Slow, uneven. Someone was coming. I gripped my tape recorder and pressed record. A man appeared from the far end of the street, moving toward me. His clothes were wrinkled, his hair disheveled. He looked like he had just woken up and walked straight out of his house. But what caught my attention was his face. His eyes darted around, wide and frantic. His lips moved, but at first, no sound came out. Then, "Help me," he whispered. My stomach tightened. The man's voice cracked as he spoke again, louder this time. "Please, someone help me." He stumbled forward, hands outstretched as if reaching for something, or someone that wasn't there. I took a step toward him. "Hey, what's wrong?" His head snapped up, and for the briefest moment, his gaze locked onto mine. I saw something in his eyes. Terror. Not the kind you feel when you're lost or afraid of the dark. This was pure horror. The kind that grips your soul and doesn't let go. And then, as he opened his mouth to scream, he vanished. Right in front of me. 1 second, he was there, breathless, desperate. The next, the air swallowed him whole. No fading. No blur. Just gone. The silence that followed felt even louder than his screams. I stood frozen, my heart hammering against my ribs. My breath came in short, shallow bursts. I forced myself to look around. Nothing. No movement. No sign of him. I lifted my tape recorder with trembling fingers and hit stop. For a long moment, I just stared at it, my mind struggling to make sense of what I had just seen. Then, with slow, deliberate movements, I rewound the tape and pressed play. The recording crackled to life. I heard the shuffle of footsteps, the faint whisper, "Help me," then the desperate cries, then the scream, and then something else, a sound I hadn't heard before. A whisper, faint, distorted, crawling beneath the man's scream like a shadow dragging itself across the floor. But it wasn't his voice, and it said my name, Danny. The morning after witnessing the impossible, I felt like I had barely slept. The image of the man disappearing into the night haunted me, looping in my mind like a broken tape. I replayed the recording again, hoping to find a logical explanation. But all I heard was the scream, sharp, desperate, and then a strange distortion, like wind rushing through a hollow tunnel. It wasn't the wind. I needed answers. The town's library was a small brick building on the edge of Main Street. Inside, the air smelled of old paper and dust, the kind of scent that clings to history. The librarian, a frail woman with deep wrinkles and watchful eyes, barely looked up from her desk as I entered. I cleared my throat. "Excuse me. I'm looking for old newspapers, town records, anything about missing people." Her eyes flicked up to meet mine, sharp and unreadable. She didn't ask why. She simply pointed to a narrow aisle near the back. "Archives are there. But if you're smart, you won't dig too deep." I ignored the warning and walked to the back of the library. The shelves were lined with yellowed newspapers bound in thick books. I ran my fingers along the spines, tracing years of forgotten stories. The dust tickled my nose as I pulled out an issue from 1978. The headline made my stomach twist. "Local man vanishes in midair. Witnesses stunned." The article described a nearly identical event to what I had seen last night. A man, seen walking down Main Street in the early hours, calling for help before simply ceasing to exist. Witnesses claimed he was swallowed by the darkness itself. The town offered no official explanation, and as I flipped through more newspapers, I found more cases. Every 5 to 10 years, someone returned to Black Hollow, only to disappear. The pattern was undeniable. A chill ran through me as I turned the next page. A faded black and white photograph caught my eye. A young boy, no older than 10, stood in front of a weathered wooden church. His face was blurred from age, but the caption below sent a spike of ice through my veins. Last known image of Peter Lorne before his disappearance. 1965. Lorne. That name, Margaret Lorne. The old woman I had met yesterday. My hands trembled as I closed the book. She had mumbled something about the shadow that comes for the guilty. Did she know something? I returned the book and made my way to the librarian. Do you know where Margaret Lorne lives? The librarian's expression darkened. Margaret doesn't get visitors. Please. It's important. She hesitated, then sighed. Out past the old cemetery. House with the blue door. But don't blame me if you don't like what you find. I thanked her and stepped outside. The afternoon sun felt weaker than before, as if the town itself was dimming. With every clue I uncovered, a gnawing feeling grew inside me. I wasn't just uncovering a mystery. I was walking straight into it. The night air was thick with silence, the kind that made your skin crawl. I stood on the sidewalk, gripping my recorder like a lifeline, waiting. The events of the previous night still played in my head. The man's desperate screams, the way his voice had been swallowed by the darkness. There was no logical explanation for what I had witnessed, and that terrified me more than anything. My watch read 2:12 a.m. A cold wind brushed past me, carrying the scent of damp asphalt and old wood. The street was empty, the flickering street lights casting long, uneasy shadows. Every house along the road had its curtains drawn, doors locked tight, as if the entire town had agreed to pretend nothing was happening. Then, right on cue, a woman stepped into view. She was young, maybe in her 20s, wearing a thin nightgown that barely moved in the breeze. Her bare feet slapped against the pavement as she stumbled forward. Her hair was wild, her eyes wide with terror. I didn't recognize her, but something about the way she moved sent a chill down my spine. She opened her mouth. Help me. Someone please. It's coming. Her voice was raw, filled with a desperation that made my stomach twist. I took a step toward her. Hey, I'm here. What's happening? She didn't seem to hear me. She just kept moving, her hands trembling as if trying to fight off something I couldn't see. I reached out, my fingers barely inches away from her shoulder. And then, she was gone, vanished. No sound, no trace. 1 second she was in front of me, pleading for her life, and the next the street was empty again. I stood there, my breath frozen in my throat, my mind struggling to process what I had just seen. It wasn't possible. There were no alleyways she could have slipped into, no doors she could have run through. It was as if something had plucked her right out of existence. I slowly raised my recorder to my ear and hit playback. The tape hissed for a moment. Then, her scream filled the speaker, loud and raw. Then silence. And then, a whisper. Faint. Almost too quiet to catch. But it was there. I rewound. Played it again. The whisper came right after the scream, seeping through the static like something pressing its lips against my ear. You shouldn't be here. A shiver ran down my spine. I spun around, scanning the street, the houses, the alleyways. Nothing moved. No wind, no footsteps, no sign that anything had ever been here except me. But I knew I wasn't alone. Something was watching me. And now, it knew I was watching back. I sat on the floor of my motel room, surrounded by a mess of papers, red ink circling names and dates like bloodstains. A sinking feeling gnawed at my gut as I traced my finger along the patterns forming before me. The people who had vanished, they all had something in common. Every single one of them had left Black Hollow at some point in their lives, only to return before disappearing for good. I leaned closer, flipping through old news clippings I had snuck out from the town's archives. Pages yellowed with age, ink fading, yet the stories remained. Each article carried the same eerie thread. Someone had come back to town, lived here for a short while, then walked down the street at night, calling for help. And then nothing. No body, no leads, no evidence. Just gone. I exhaled slowly, my breath unsteady. My hands trembled as I reached for my tape recorder and pressed play. The familiar sound of last night's scream filled the room, a sharp, piercing wail that rose and fell, twisting into something unnatural. But then, buried beneath it, something else, low murmurs, words I couldn't quite make out. I rewound and listened again, heart pounding. The whispers weren't random. They were speaking to me. I swallowed hard and grabbed my notebook, scrawling out every disappearance I could find. The dates formed a disturbing rhythm, decades apart, yet repeating, like a cycle, like something that never really stopped, just waited. A knock at my door made me jump. My pulse spiked, and for a split second, I feared the worst. I hesitated, then stepped forward and pulled it open. Deputy Harris stood there, his face pale, his lips pressed into a thin line. "You need to stop digging," he said, his voice hushed. His eyes darted behind him, scanning the empty motel parking lot before settling back on me. "I don't know why you came here, but this town doesn't want you knowing things you shouldn't." I clenched my jaw. "Then tell me, what happens at 2:13 a.m.? Why do they scream? Where do they go?" His nostrils flared, and for a moment, I thought he might actually answer. But then he exhaled sharply and stepped back. "You should leave before it's too late," he muttered. "Some things don't like being watched." The door clicked shut, leaving me alone with my racing thoughts. My skin prickled as I turned back to my notes. Harris knew something. They all did. But whatever it was, they were too afraid to say it. I checked the time, 1:45 a.m. My heartbeat quickened. I needed to see it again. I grabbed my coat, shoved my notebook into my bag, and stepped outside. The air was colder than before, thick with something unseen, something that made the hairs on my arms stand up. The street was empty, but I felt watched, like the town itself was waiting for what was coming. I walked to the main road, my breath clouding in the night air. Silence stretched around me. Not even a dog barked. Not even the wind stirred. The whole town held its breath. Then, from somewhere down the street, the sound of footsteps. Slow, unsteady. A shadow moved under the glow of the streetlight. I held my breath. A man emerged from the darkness, his face contorted in sheer terror. He staggered forward, eyes wide, lips trembling. Then he opened his mouth and screamed. I froze. The sound cut through the air like a blade, raw and desperate. I wanted to run to him, to grab him, to shake him and ask who, or what, was after him. But as I stepped forward, he vanished. Gone. Just like that. As if he had never been there at all. I stood there, paralyzed, my own breath hammering in my chest. The silence that followed was even worse than the scream. I fumbled for my recorder with shaking hands, pressed stop, and turned on the playback. My ears rang, waiting for what I knew I'd hear. The scream, the whispers, and this time something else. A voice saying my name. The church smelled of must and old wood, as if it hadn't seen a crowd in decades. The faint light of the gas lamps outside flickered through the stained glass windows, casting eerie patterns on the cracked wooden pews. I pushed open the door slowly, the hinges groaning under the strain, and stepped into the cold, hollow silence. Father Caldwell had agreed to meet me after I convinced him that I wasn't just another tourist or a curious passerby looking for ghost stories. He had seen too many of them, he told me. People who came to Black Hollow looking for answers, only to leave with more questions, and a few missing pieces of their sanity. The priest sat behind a large wooden desk, his face hidden in shadow. His hands, knotted with age, rested on an old leather-bound Bible, but his eyes, they were what I couldn't look away from. They seemed tired, but not in the way you'd expect from someone who had spent years tending to a church. No, there was something darker about them, something that told me he knew exactly what was going on, and had known for far too long. Mr. Mercer, he greeted me, his voice raspy, like someone who hadn't spoken to anyone in years. I was wondering when you would come. I should have expected it. I felt a chill at his words, but I pushed it aside. I wasn't here for small talk. I was here for answers. I need to know what happened here, Father. What's really going on with the disappearances? He paused, and for a moment, his gaze flickered towards the dark corners of the church, as if someone, was watching us from the shadows. The truth is not easy to swallow, Mr. Mercer, he said finally. But you're too far in now. You've heard the screams, haven't you? I nodded, though I hadn't expected him to ask that. The screams. They were the only thing that brought me to Black Hollow in the first place, and yet I hadn't been able to escape them since I'd arrived. Every night, without fail, at exactly 2:13 a.m., they haunted me. They haunted the town. Father Caldwell leaned forward, and his voice dropped to a whisper, as if the walls themselves might be listening. It's not a man doing the screaming, Mr. Mercer. It's the town itself. The town has a debt to pay, and it's been paying it for generations. I felt my pulse quicken. What do you mean a debt? What is this town hiding? Father Caldwell stood up, his joints cracking as he moved. He walked over to a small, dusty cabinet by the wall and pulled out an old, leather-bound journal. The pages were yellowed, the ink faded, as if it had been written by hands long gone. He handed it to me without a word, and I felt an unease settle in my stomach as my fingers brushed against the worn cover. "This is the truth, Mr. Mercer," he said quietly. "It's all in here." I opened the journal carefully, the first page reading simply, "The ritual must be kept, or all will be lost." The words seemed to swim before my eyes, their meaning lost in the hazy remnants of long-forgotten fears. I turned the page, and there it was, the explanation I had been looking for, though I didn't want to read it. The priest's voice was barely above a murmur as he spoke the words that made my blood run cold. Black Hollow was once a town of prosperity, but prosperity always comes with a price. You see, long ago, the people of this town, they did something unforgivable, something that called the Shadow Walker into this world. A creature, not of flesh and blood, but of darkness. It feeds on guilt, on fear. The town made a deal with it, Mr. Mercer. They promised it a sacrifice to keep it at bay. But they made a mistake. He paused, his eyes locking onto mine, the weight of his words pressing down on me. That sacrifice, it wasn't enough. So the Shadow Walker returned. It comes for the guilty, for those who have wronged others. And it comes at exactly 2:13 a.m., when the town is most vulnerable. I closed the journal, my hands trembling. I felt sick. The pieces were starting to come together, but they didn't make sense. But what does that have to do with the people who are disappearing now? Father Caldwell's face darkened. It's not random, Mr. Mercer. The people who disappear, they're all connected. They've all wronged someone, and now the Shadow Walker is collecting its debt. I swallowed hard, the weight of his words crashing into me. The victims weren't just chosen at random, they were guilty of something. I had a horrible feeling that I was somehow connected to this curse. But what had I done to deserve this? The priest looked down at his hands, a deep sigh escaping him. "And you, Mr. Mercer?" He paused again, his voice barely audible. "You've seen it too, haven't you? You've heard its whispers." I froze. The whispers. I hadn't told him about them, but somehow he knew. I nodded slowly, feeling the air around me grow thicker. "The Shadow Walker knows you," he continued, his voice low and almost regretful. "It's been waiting for you, Mr. Mercer. Your past, it's tied to this town. It always has been." I stood up abruptly, my chair scraping against the floor as I backed away from him. The room felt suffocating, like the walls were closing in. The cold draft from the door sent a shiver down my spine, but it was nothing compared to the cold that was creeping inside me. "What do you mean? What did I do?" My voice was shaky, but I couldn't stop it. The fear was overwhelming, suffocating. The priest's eyes softened with what seemed like pity, but there was no mercy in them. "You'll remember soon enough, Mr. Mercer," he said, his voice full of finality. "And when you do, you'll understand why the Shadow Walker is coming for you." I didn't want to hear any more. I didn't want to know the truth. But as I turned and left the church, I felt it, its presence, lingering in the air, a shadow that was always just behind me, just out of sight. The town knew my name now, and the Shadow Walker knew me too. I had been wandering through Black Hollow for days now, trying to make sense of the madness unfolding around me. Each night, the screams haunted me, like they were echoing from my very soul. I could feel the weight of the town pressing on me, like it knew I was getting too close to something dangerous, something it wanted to keep buried. I couldn't stop. I had to know. I had to uncover what the hell was happening here. That's when I found it, the journal. I was back in the church again, feeling that strange pull toward the old, decaying building. The door creaked when I opened it, the wood groaning under the pressure, as if it had been waiting for me. The pews were covered in dust, and the air was thick with the smell of mildew and rot. Nothing seemed to move except the shadows, which shifted in the corners like they were alive, watching me. I wandered toward the altar, my footsteps muffled by the thick carpet. I had searched the church before, but this time, something felt different, like I was being guided towards something hidden. As I approached the small wooden door at the back of the church, I noticed a faint, almost imperceptible marking on the floor, a little scrape in the wood. My heart skipped a beat. I bent down, running my fingers along the mark, and pushed. The door creaked open with a sound that seemed to echo through the entire building, and I stepped into the narrow, dimly lit room. There, on an old wooden shelf, sat a leather-bound book. Its cover was cracked, the edges frayed, and dust had settled on it like a thick, suffocating blanket. My fingers shook as I reached for it. The moment I opened the book, the words on the yellowed pages seemed to jump out at me. It was as if the book had been waiting for someone to read it, to finally reveal the secret it had kept for so long. The writing was frantic, rushed, as if whoever wrote it had known their time was running out. The pages spoke of a ritual, a twisted tradition that the town of Black Hollow had followed for generations. A ritual to appease something ancient, something dark. The townspeople had made a deal. They had sacrificed a child to keep the town safe, to keep the darkness at bay. They called it the Shadow Walker, an entity that fed on fear, on guilt, on death. And the price for that safety? A life, a chosen life. I froze as I read. My stomach churned. It was always a child, always someone innocent, someone with no say in their fate. But the journal didn't just talk about the ritual. It mentioned the price for breaking it. It said that the town had betrayed the rules, and the balance had been lost. People started to return, lured by the same curse that had been placed on the town so long ago. I couldn't believe what I was reading. This was no longer just a string of strange disappearances. This was something worse, something far darker. The town was built on blood, on a sacrifice that kept them safe, but now that safety was unraveling. The sins of the past had come back to claim what they were owed. I turned the page, my hands trembling. There, at the bottom of the journal, scrawled in desperate, jagged handwriting, was a name, Daniel Mercer. I slammed the book shut, my pulse racing. No, this couldn't be right. It had to be a mistake. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized this town had not just been hiding the truth from me. They had been hiding me. I was part of it. As a child, I had lived in Black Hollow. I had been one of them. But I had left. I had escaped. Or so I thought. The Shadow Walker wasn't just after anyone. It was after me because I was the one who got away. I was the one who was never supposed to leave. I stood there, the weight of the journal pressing down on me, as the reality of it all settled in. I wasn't just investigating a town haunted by the past. I was investigating my own past, the truth about why I had left Black Hollow in the first place, the truth about why they had let me go. And now, the time had come. The sins of this town had found me again. They wanted their sacrifice. They wanted me. I was the chosen one. I sat in the old church, the air heavy with dust and the scent of stale wood. The walls, once white, had darkened with age and neglect, and the few broken stained glass windows let in only shards of moonlight. There was a coldness in the room, an unsettling chill that clung to the back of my neck as I flipped through the worn journal I'd found hidden beneath the church floorboards. I hadn't expected to find anything useful in the journal. I thought it would be more of the same cryptic ramblings or prayers from a long-dead priest. But what I found made my blood run cold. The words were jagged, written in a hurried hand, as if the writer feared someone might find them. And I was about to understand why. The journal spoke of something the townspeople called the ritual, a dark act performed long ago to protect Black Hollow from an unknown evil. The townspeople had promised to feed this evil, this entity, something in exchange for their safety. A sacrifice, they called it, an innocent life to keep the town untouched by the darkness that surrounded it. The entity that protected them, the thing that they called the Shadow Walker, would not stop until it was fed. As I read on, a sick feeling twisted in my stomach. The sacrifices weren't random. They had a purpose. They weren't made to some abstract god or demon. They were made to feed a presence that could move between the cracks of this world and the next. But what unsettled me most was the final entry, buried deep within the journal's pages. A name, Daniel Mercer. My name. I blinked and rubbed my eyes, thinking it was some mistake. Maybe it was a coincidence. Maybe another Daniel had lived here, years before I was born. But there was no denying the next line. It was too specific, too direct. It spoke of a child who had been born into the town, someone who had escaped the curse. That child was supposed to be the next sacrifice to the Shadow Walker. The journal didn't just mention the child by name. It mentioned my family, my ancestors who had once lived in Black Hollow. I felt my heart race. My breath caught in my throat as the truth began to settle in. I wasn't just some outsider. I wasn't here by chance. I had lived in Black Hollow before, as a child, but I had left. Somehow, I had escaped the curse when I was young, but the town had never forgotten. I leaned back in my chair, suddenly dizzy, my thoughts spiraling. I remembered bits of my childhood, a strange feeling of déjà vu. But now it felt like pieces of a broken puzzle were finally falling into place. There were moments I couldn't explain, faces of people I shouldn't remember. I'd been brought here, back to this town, back to this place. For this. The Shadow Walker knew me. It was watching me. It had been watching me since I was a child, waiting for the moment I would return. And now I knew why. As I read more of the journal, a name kept appearing. Father Caldwell, the priest who had written these pages. He had been the one who had conducted the ritual that kept the town alive, but his record ended abruptly. There was no more after that last entry. Just silence. I could hear the ticking of the old clock on the wall, the only sound in the room. Tick, tick, tick. My hands trembled as I closed the journal, but the weight of what I'd read clung to me like a shadow. I couldn't escape. I needed answers, but I couldn't just leave. I couldn't walk away from this. Not when I knew what I did now. Not when I knew the truth. I stood up, shaking. The air around me felt thicker, as though the walls were pressing in. I could feel it, the Shadow Walker. I wasn't sure how, but I could feel its presence now. I wasn't safe anymore. I never had been. I rushed out of the church, the door creaking as it slammed behind me. The moon was bright in the sky, but the shadows seemed deeper, more alive than before. The road ahead was empty, but the scream of a distant person, desperate and full of terror, echoed across the town. It was 2:13 a.m., and I was next. I had to face it. I had to confront the Shadow Walker, confront my own past. Or it would come for me like it had come for them, like it had always been coming for me. I began walking down the main road, the familiar street I'd avoided for so many years. Every step felt heavier, as if I was being drawn into something that had already started long before my arrival. The distant scream grew louder in my ears. The figure I'd seen the night before, the one who looked like me, appeared in the corner of my mind, standing in the darkness. I was no longer just a witness. I was part of the town's curse, and the truth had found me. The air in Black Hollow felt different that night. Heavy, suffocating, as if the town itself was holding its breath. I sat at the small desk in my motel room, watching the clock tick closer to 2:13 a.m. My heart beat erratically, too fast, too hard, as if it knew what was coming, what had to come. My hands trembled as I stared at the recorder in front of me, the device that had captured the voices, the whispers, the screams. I wasn't ready, but I had no choice. There was no escaping this. I had come looking for answers, searching for a story, but now I realized it was never about that. Black Hollow wasn't just a place. It was a nightmare that had been waiting for me, a nightmare with a long, dark history. My past, and it was closing in on me like a vice. The clock struck 2:13. My breath caught in my throat. It was like everything in the room, the walls, the windows, the floor beneath my feet, had all stopped moving. There was no sound, no creaking floorboards, no rustling in the wind outside. Just an eerie, suffocating silence that seemed to grow thicker by the second. Then I heard it. A scream. A woman's scream. But it wasn't just any scream. It was my scream. I jumped up, my heart hammering in my chest. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and my legs froze in place. It was me, I knew it. It was my voice, but not. It was a sound from the deepest part of my soul. A sound I couldn't explain. A sound I hadn't made yet. But I heard it. I felt it, and I had to follow it. I grabbed my jacket and bolted out the door. The cold night air hit me like a slap, and I stumbled forward, not caring where I was going. The street was empty, just like every other night. But tonight, it felt different. It felt like the whole town was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen, waiting for me to find out what I'd forgotten. I walked down the main road, the silence pressing against my ears like a thick fog. The streetlights flickered above me, casting long, eerie shadows that seemed to stretch and twist as if they were alive. I looked around, my eyes scanning every corner, every darkened alley. But all I saw was the road ahead, leading to nowhere. And then I saw it, a figure, walking down the street, slowly, deliberately. The figure was tall, cloaked in darkness, but it wasn't a stranger. It wasn't someone new. It was me. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The figure was me. Same posture, same height, same walk. But there was something wrong in the way it moved, in the way its steps echoed on the pavement. The air grew colder as the figure came closer, its face hidden in the shadow of its hood. It wasn't until it reached the flickering light of a street lamp that I saw it. Its eyes. They were my eyes. But they were hollow, empty, voids that sucked the light around them. I couldn't look away. I wanted to scream, but I couldn't make a sound. My legs refused to move. The figure stopped. It was standing right in front of me now. I could feel the chill radiating from it, a coldness that dug deep into my bones. The silence stretched between us like a taut wire, and I felt like I was choking on it. Then the figure spoke. "Do you know who you are?" The voice wasn't mine. It was deeper, darker, cracking like old wood breaking under pressure. But it was the same voice I had heard in the recordings. The same voice I had heard in my dreams. The same voice that had whispered my name in the dead of night. I wanted to run, but my body was frozen. I couldn't escape it. It was me, but not me. And it was asking me questions I didn't want to answer. Questions I didn't have answers to. "Do you know what you've done?" the figure asked, its voice dragging like the weight of centuries. I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. The truth I had tried so desperately to bury, was crashing into me like a tidal wave. I had done something terrible, something that had sealed my fate long ago. I had been part of something, and I had forgotten it. Forgotten the town. Forgotten its sins. Forgotten my own role in it. The figure's eyes bored into mine, its gaze pulling at something deep inside me. "You ran, but you were never meant to escape," it said. "You were always meant to return. And now it's time." Time for what? I couldn't breathe. My lungs felt like they were filled with ice, and I couldn't move. The world around me seemed to fade away. The street lights, the houses, the trees, they all dissolved into the darkness. The only thing left was the figure. And me. The coldness surrounded me, sinking into my skin, into my soul. And I knew, deep down, that I had no choice now. The town, the curse, the shadow walker, it was all part of me. I had come back to face it, to face myself. The figure raised its hand, and I felt a pull, a force, dragging me forward. I wanted to resist, to fight, but I couldn't. I was trapped in the same cycle that had claimed the others before me, trapped in a town that had never let me go. "Make your choice," the figure whispered, its voice like death itself. "Expose the truth, and burn this place to the ground. Or surrender, and let it live on forever." I had to decide. Break the cycle, and let the world know the horrors Black Hollow had hidden, or surrender, letting the Shadow Walker continue its work, letting the town stay in its cursed slumber. But there was no escaping it now. At that moment, I realized the choice had already been made for me. I stood frozen in the middle of Main Street, staring at the figure before me. I had been prepared for a lot, but this wasn't something anyone could be ready for. The street was still, as if the air itself held its breath, and everything, the town, the buildings, the snow, felt like it was waiting for something. Something that was just about to break. There was no doubt about it. The figure before me was me. It was me. Same height, same scruffy hair, same worn-out jacket. But the eyes were different. Empty, black as pitch, void of everything. It stood there, screaming, helpless, as if the world had just turned its back on it. But it wasn't real. Or was it? "Help!" I heard my voice shout, and it wasn't even me shouting anymore. It was just a sound, a hollow cry that echoed down the road like a whispering ghost. My legs felt like stone. I tried to move, but they didn't respond. The figure, my figure, kept walking closer, step by step, as if drawn by some unseen force. I swallowed hard, my throat dry. "What do you want from me?" I asked, my voice trembling despite myself. The air felt colder now, colder than it had ever been. I tried to speak again, but the words caught in my throat. My body wouldn't obey. And then the voice came, not from the figure, but from all around me, thick and dark, like something pulling me down into the earth. "I want you to remember." I didn't even know how to react. My heart hammered in my chest, my mind a whirlwind of thoughts I could barely hold on to. What did it mean by remember? What was I supposed to remember? The figure stopped in front of me, inches away, and its gaze locked onto mine. I was staring into my own eyes, but they were soulless, cold. "Do you remember what you did?" The voice, still not from the figure, but from everywhere, whispered again, heavy with menace. "Do you remember what you are responsible for?" I didn't know what it meant. My breath came in short gasps. I shook my head, desperate to escape this moment, but my body wouldn't move. I was trapped in it. Suddenly, everything changed. The ground beneath my feet shifted, as though the world had started to tilt. The snow in the street began swirling around me, spiraling up like a vortex. And in the eye of the storm stood the figure, still me, but different. I could feel the pull now, like something was dragging me toward it, as if it were the end, and I was just another lost soul, bound to it. "You're not just anyone," the voice said, its tone low and suffocating. "You were a part of the sin. You always have been. You knew what they did. You saw the child's body. You saw it, and you ran." The truth hit me like a physical blow. The images flooded back, sharp and sudden. I was a child again, standing in that very church, my heart thundering in my chest as I watched them. The town elders, the priest, they had sacrificed him. The boy, the one who should have been my friend, they did it to keep the curse away, to keep the shadow walker at bay. I had run, I had left, and they had let me. I thought I was safe. I thought I was free, but they had all paid for it. The ones who stayed, the ones who had covered up what we had done, what I had done. And now, the shadow walker was here, waiting for me to pay the price. "You are here because you were always meant to be," the voice continued, thick with power. "You will either join them, or you will expose what was buried. The town will fall either way." The words hung in the air like a shroud. I could feel my pulse racing, the panic rising in my chest. My mind screamed at me to run, but there was nowhere to go. I couldn't escape what was happening. The past was here, and it was demanding something from me. The question was what I would give. "I can expose everything," I whispered, almost as if to myself. "I can tell the world what they did, the town, the sacrifice. But the shadow walker," I shook its head slowly, a smile forming on its lips, twisted and cruel. "And what happens then?" it asked softly, the words cutting through the air like ice. "Do you think the world will listen? Do you think they will care?" I opened my mouth, but nothing came out. The truth felt so much heavier now. It wasn't just about the town anymore. It was about me. I had thought I was running away from the past, but the past had never left me. The shadow walker had always been with me, waiting for the right moment to drag me back. "Or you could surrender," the figure said, its voice now barely a whisper. "Let it in. Let it take you. Let the town go on. Safe." I could feel the pull. It was gentle at first, a soft nudge, then a stronger tug. It promised safety, a chance to forget everything, to walk away. I thought about the people, the ones who had stayed behind. If I ran, if I surrendered, they might be spared. The curse might stop. The cycle could be broken. But at what cost? Was that the answer? To let this town's sins die with me? Could I really just walk away from everything I had learned? Could I turn my back on the truth that would destroy them? I didn't have long. The vortex in front of me was growing, the darkness closing in. The figure, the shadow walker, was waiting for my answer, its cold, empty eyes locked on mine. "Make your choice," it whispered. "Sacrifice yourself, or expose the truth. The consequence will be the same." I closed my eyes, trying to gather whatever courage I had left. For a moment, everything was still. The winds died down. The snow settled. The shadow loomed over me. And then, in the quiet, I heard my voice again. I choose to expose it. The words burned in my throat as they left my lips. The moment they did, the ground beneath me cracked. The darkness exploded around me, swirling into the sky, engulfing everything in its path. I had made my choice, but at what cost? I can hear the wind whispering through the cracks in the old motel window, the kind of sound that makes you feel like you're not alone, even when you know you should be. It's late, later than I should have stayed up, but I can't help it. The town of Black Hollow is quiet tonight, too quiet, almost as if it's holding its breath, waiting for something. I've been here for only a few days now, and already the stories have started sinking in. They say it's just a myth, that everything that happened here was years ago, that nothing like that could happen again. But I know better. The locals can tell you the same lies 1,000 times over, but there's always a truth buried somewhere. I've seen enough to know when something's wrong, and this place is wrong, too wrong. It doesn't matter how many fresh coats of paint they slap on the walls, or how many new faces show up looking for answers. The shadows here know how to swallow you whole. It's almost 2 a.m. The old man at the diner gave me that look when I asked about the screams. The one that said, "You're a fool if you don't leave." His eyes weren't scared, just tired. Tired of seeing people come and go. Tired of watching the same tragedy unfold again and again. "It's just a story," he had said, his voice low like it might crack under the weight of it all. "People leave. They don't come back." I wasn't buying it. The way he said it, the way he almost looked over his shoulder when he spoke, it wasn't fear, it was resignation. Like he knew something I didn't, like he'd seen it with his own eyes. Now here I am, sitting in this small motel room, waiting for the inevitable. I should leave. I should pack up my things and drive back home where things are safe. But there's something about Black Hollow that calls to you, that drags you into its depths. It's like the place doesn't let you go, no matter how hard you try. I glance at the clock. 2:13 a.m. My pulse quickens. I hear it, a scream, sharp, desperate, cutting through the stillness of the night. It's unmistakable. Someone is out there, trapped, calling for help. The scream echoes in my ears, and my heart races as I grab my coat and rush outside. My breath fogs up in the cold air, and my feet crunch on the snow-covered ground. The streets of Black Hollow are empty, but the sound, that scream, it's getting louder. I follow it, instinct driving me forward, even though every fiber of my being tells me to turn back. There, just ahead, a figure, a man, stumbling down the road, his face twisted in fear. His hands are raised as if to ward off something invisible, his body jerking with each scream. He doesn't look back, just keeps moving, dragging his feet across the snow. His breath comes in shallow gasps. I freeze. I want to call out to him, to tell him he's not alone, that I'm here, but the words get stuck in my throat. And then, just as quickly as he appeared, he's gone. Vanished. I stand there, my breath coming out in heavy puffs. The street is empty now, just the soft flicker of a dying street lamp casting long shadows on the pavement. My mind races. Did I imagine it? Was it a trick of the light? But I know what I saw. I know what I heard. I feel a chill at the back of my neck. A presence. Someone is watching me. I spin around, and there it is, a shadow at the far end of the street. It's a figure, tall and indistinct, like it's made of the night itself. It doesn't move, just stands there silent, watching. I can't see its face, but I feel its gaze. It's not human. No, it's something older, something that shouldn't exist. My breath catches in my throat, and the world around me feels too quiet, too still. My heart beats faster, and every instinct tells me to run. But I can't. I don't even know if I want to. I watch it for what feels like hours, though I know it's only moments. The figure doesn't approach, doesn't make a sound. It just stands there waiting for me to move. I take a slow step back, then another, but the figure doesn't follow. It doesn't need to. It's already inside my head. My mind races back to the old man at the diner, to the stories I heard. The people who came here before me, the ones who vanished. All of them. They were here for a reason. They came because the place called to them, because Black Hollow knows how to pull you in, and once you're in, you can never leave. I turn and walk quickly back to the motel. The figure doesn't follow, but I know it's there, in the shadows. Watching. waiting for the next fool to arrive. I lock the door behind me, and for a moment, I feel safe. But I know it won't last. The town never lets you go. I look at the clock. 2:13 a.m. Another scream rips through the night. Another soul calling for help. And somewhere in the distance, I hear the faint echo of my own voice, calling back. It's already begun.